Welcome to the What's Your Grief podcast. I'm Eleanor Haley.
And I'm Lisa Williams. We're the mental health professionals turned grief friends turned co-founders of the website What's Your Grief.
In this podcast, we talk candidly about all things grief, from pop culture to grief theory.
No tilted heads, no soothing tones, just us and our grief friends exploring the always devastating,
often confusing,
and sometimes even funny experience of living life after loss.
Hey, welcome to the What's Your Grief podcast. This is Eleanor, and as always, I'm joined by Lisa. Lisa, I'm wondering, where are you joining us from today? I haven't asked you where you are in the world.
I'm in the UK at the moment,
okay,
but I will be back in Baltimore in 5 days.
All right, so, you're like,
yes.
Where in the world is Carmen
Where in the
San Diego?
Yeah, no, I will be back in Baltimore, and I'm happy to get back to warmer weather because it is not warm here. And also it is today, actually, when we're recording, is my mom's birthday, and then Sunday is Mother's Day. So I'll get home in time to be able to we always do sort of a joint birthday, Mother's Day thing for my mom. So
wait, when is Mother's Day? It's this Sunday? This Sunday?
Yeah, this Sunday.
Oh my gosh. I am so bad with dates. Like, time just flies by. It's like it crawls, but it flies all at the same time. And I am just, things just sneak up on me. Like, I am a mother. I should know this, but I did not realize
that.
Okay.
It is.
All right. Well,
this shows that you've not been on grief social media lately, because it's already very present on grief social media. I've actually been thinking about it a lot. I know we're unique in that we follow a lot of grief accounts. So most people, I think, who are getting their grief support aren't necessarily following like 200 plus different grief accounts. But I was thinking about, I hope not, but I was thinking about how it's interesting because it's all the first Mother's Day stuff that I started seeing much earlier than I started seeing any like Hallmark ads or the things that can sometimes be really like activating and stuff. The earliest things I started seeing about Mother's Day were actually all about grief related Mother's Day things. And I was like, this is such a weird, like, interesting shift. And it's great. I mean, it's great in that it's obviously because there's a lot of people providing grief support, trying to like make sure that that is getting out there. And most people aren't feeling overwhelmed by it in their feeds. But it's really funny because in the What's Your Grief feed, it's like 1,000 reminders of Mother's Day.
Well,
not necessarily that you would not, I mean, I was thinking like, oh, I don't know if I was this isn't great.
Well, use me
through
as an example. Yeah, like using me as an example. Now, granted, I just said I'm terrible with dates and calendars. I literally just did my calendar yesterday and missed this. But so somebody who's really tuned in and aware, maybe you work somewhere like a school where they talk about, oh, what are we gonna like? I know, like at my daughter's school, they're making something for Mother's Day, you know, things like that. So maybe you are really tuned in, but if you otherwise wouldn't be tuned in, because like I'm a classic example, because I don't follow all those feeds because you do most of the Instagram stuff. And so I totally wasn't even thinking about it. So it's like following the grief stuff is what kind of reminds you.
I know.
In this situation.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I was thinking. I was like, this is so interesting. It hadn't really been on my radar that Mother's Day was coming up until pretty early I started seeing grief stuff about Mother's Day. And I was like, oh, wow. It's a big shift compared to even like 5 years ago, I would say, to see that coming out early. And, you know, it's just sort of a reminder. I know like, we've said this with like awareness days too, of sometimes, you know, you just decide to stop following a hashtag or to mute something or whatever. I think it's important to be able to say, sometimes you need to mute grief support things too, because it does get to be, I think we may be the anomaly since we're following so many things, but I think like being aware, oh wait, if following all this grief support stuff means that now my feed is being sort of overwhelmed by things that are feeling more like unhelpful reminders instead of helpful support, that it's okay to be Like I need to maybe mute
Yeah.
this until after Mother's Day or take a couple
Yeah.
steps back.
Well, and I think we can get caught up in a cycle of using social media in a way that's so mindless that you might not take stock. You might not stop to take stock and say, like, is this actually providing me support for something I was already feeling? Is this like, oh, I love seeing this post because it makes me feel less alone because I was already thinking this? Or is it making you say, like, oh, I wasn't sad about that before, but now I am? So I do think taking a moment, we don't always like reflect on
Yeah.
how social media is making us feel, but taking a moment, especially during these times of year, to stop and reflect is
Yeah.
probably a really good idea. With all that said, What's Your Grief has a ton of articles about coping with Mother's Day
True.
after a loss. We just haven't been posting them a lot, but we will. But that's actually not what we're here to talk about today.
No.
Today, we're talking about something that we think, we were talking about this a little before starting, that we think is really useful for anybody, but a lot of people, when they hear the term, sort of, I think, to dismiss it. Maybe it might feel a little buzzwordy to some, to others it might feel a little touchy feely, but it's none of those things. So we wanted to take a little time to talk about it, and the topic we wanted to really kind of deep dive in a way is the idea of self compassion.
Yes. And I think it's interesting because I think it does sometimes put some people off, but the term itself, but I think that's because a lot of times people don't dig into the nuance of
Mm-hmm.
what is meant by self-compassion and what it really is. And I think hopefully that's the value in talking about it a little bit more in depth today, is that it gives a more nuanced view of what self-compassion actually is and why it's helpful and why it's valuable, and also why it's hard. I mean, I don't know, maybe that feels like a helpful place to start. I think it's hard in life, not just in grief. I think oftentimes we have, even before we go through a loss, sometimes we have been raised with ideas of feeling like, oh, I need to use a little bit of maybe self-criticism or self-judgment
Mm-hmm.
or a little bit of that to motivate myself, like that I need to beat myself up a little bit in order to keep myself moving forward or to keep myself being successful. And I think that sometimes starts really early for us, like all the way going back to
Mm-hmm.
childhood. Sometimes we have internalized those ideas that if I'm too kind and compassionate to myself, I'm going to be like complacent and lazy, and I'm not going to care whether I do well or whether I fail. And I need to be a little bit unkind and not
Yeah.
compassionate to myself in order to be successful.
Yeah, I think about this a lot because I think we're raised with a lot of, well, not everybody, but many kids are raised with a lot of lessons about how to be kind to other people and not so many lessons about how to be kind to ourselves. And one of the reasons I think about it as a lot is because kindness was such a big thing for my mother. And she would always kind of preach that kindness, doing the kind thing. And I feel like a lot of times it ended up being kindness at the expense of oneself and one's own comfort. Not so much for me because I was like kind of a bad kid, but the rest of my family like would sort of self-sacrifice in a way to be kind to other people, but not always to be kind to themselves. And so I've thought about this a lot. I really appreciate that my mom raised me with those messages and my brothers and sisters, and I see how it's kind of trickled down to the next generation. But at the same time, something I've been really thoughtful about is how to also teach my kids to know when it's okay to say no and have certain kind of boundaries, and when it's okay to be kind to oneself just as much as being kind to other people. But I do think it doesn't always come natural. And of course, my experience is anecdotal, and maybe you were raised in a totally different way. But that's something that I think maybe, I think, Lisa, you can probably relate
Oh,
to this just based on how
I
you've shared to me your mom raised you.
Oh my gosh, I can relate to this so deeply. And I don't know if you remember this because this is like going way back because your girls were little. But
Yeah.
I remember having this moment of like deep respect for your parenting about setting boundaries and allowing your kids to decide what they wanted to do. One day when I was at your house, and there was a little girl from the neighborhood who wanted to play, and like your girls didn't want to play, and you were really supportive of them not
Yeah.
playing, of just, deciding what they wanted to do for themselves. And my childhood, I mean, truly, I was raised on this idea that you could not say no to someone if they invited you somewhere, if they wanted you to do something, if they wanted, it didn't matter if you wanted to go, if you liked where they were going, if you liked the thing they were doing, if you liked them. It was just,
Yeah.
you suck it up and you go. And it has not served me well. Like, I internalized a lot of feelings of guilt that I was supposed to
Right.
just compromise all of my own needs and put all of those aside and just say, like, oh wait, if it would make somebody else happy that
Yes.
I was going to go to the beach with them for a week, then I just had to go to the beach with them for
Yeah.
a week, even if I like didn't want to.
I think in many ways it becomes like a case by case thing. Like there are definitely times when I encourage my kids to like, you know what, I don't know, like you said no a couple times, you want to maintain that for like think about this, But then there are times when there are very good reasons why they might want to say no. And I think for me, I just want them to know that choosing their own comfort is an option, and that
Yeah.
saying no is but it's case by case. We need to be thoughtful, but this is an option, is to choose yourself and to be kind to yourself. And I think it just doesn't always come natural, thinking about that kindness to oneself or putting one's needs, first. And in grief, a lot of times that becomes a problem for people who don't ever put their needs first. They end up, if they do put their needs first, they feel guilty, or they don't, and they end up never attending to their own needs. So I think like self-kindness can be so helpful just in life, and of course in grief. Like one of the classic examples is like, say to yourself, imagine that the messages you were saying to yourself or the situations you were putting yourself in, imagine a friend was telling you these same like negative things about themselves, or telling you that they're putting themselves in this situation. And what would you say to them? And most often, if a friend is like beating themselves up or like bending over backwards for everybody but themselves, you as that kind friend would be like, no, don't, you need to like put your own needs first, or you need to stop talking to yourself like that. And we often are able to easily give that kindness to other people, but we aren't able to give it to ourselves. And so I think, like you said, it's such an important thing in general, but then in grief, especially, one, because of what I said, like oftentimes we have needs that need to get met. And two, I think just because we can really be hard on ourselves about quote unquote, like how well we're grieving or how we're doing it.
Yeah. And I think part of the distance is that sometimes we're not, and I'll speak for myself and my own upbringing, which you've all heard, is that sometimes I think in part, if we're raised in a way that doesn't help us to be attuned to our own needs, it's hard to extend ourselves self-compassion or self-kindness, and some of the things that go together with all of these things, because we aren't really good at kind of figuring out just like how to be with ourselves and just be kind. If it's always been focused outwards, it is a little bit of hard work sometimes to figure out how to just like be with yourself in a
Yeah.
comfortable way, no matter what is going on, no matter how much you're struggling, no matter how well things are going, no matter how hard things are. If the focus has always been to be attuned and kind and compassionate and caring to everyone else, and it's just sometimes hard to even figure out what it means to treat oneself with self-compassion, because you have to practice just being attuned to yourself first.
I think another thing that I don't know so much whether this is kind of a thing for every generation, but I know our generation was brought up in the era of like really emphasizing self-esteem.
Mm-hmm.
And something that Kristen Neff, who's a really prominent self-compassion like writer and researcher and talker on the subject, we'll talk a little bit about how she outlined self-compassion in a minute. Something that she talks about is how self-compassion differs from self-esteem, and self-kindness differs from self-esteem, because self-esteem really, whether intended or not, leaves people with the sense that they need to be better or special or unique in order to be worthy of the kindness and compassion. And so when we feel we need to be better than other people or exceptional or stand out, what that often ends up doing is separating us from other people, or even maybe causing us to have to put other people down in order to raise ourselves up or feel better about ourselves, or put ourselves down because we don't perceive ourselves to be better than other people. And so I think for some people that might have been, I don't think that was the intended effect, but it's sometimes the unintended consequence of kind of focusing on that betterness or uniqueness or specialness or differentness.
Yeah, there's a scale that they use in research about compassion and self-compassion that is this fear of compassion scale, but they look at like fear of compassion towards others and self-compassion. And on the self-compassion questions, two of them that they ask, one of them is that if I develop self-compassion, or develop compassion for myself, that I will lose my self-criticism and my flaws will show. One of them is I will become someone who I don't want to be. And actually, there's another one that says my standards will drop. I will become a weak person. And I think all of those are sort of tied in some way to that self-esteem thing a little bit too. Like I need to be working hard to differentiate myself and tie my worth to these outcomes that were connected with self-esteem, right? You feel good if you got an A, you feel, confident if you're really talented about something. And so it was connected with these ideas that we had to have this outcome and we had to make sure to hold ourselves to certain standards in order to get there, that maybe we were working harder than someone else or differentiating ourselves from other people who didn't get an A. And all of those, I think, subtly might get connected to some of those questions they ask on the scale of, is all of that secretly kind of a fear that is hanging out in the background of our worry about self-compassion because we've been raised on an idea of self-esteem?
Yeah, it also, this is maybe an aside, but it makes me think of that idea of being raised with conditional positive regard versus unconditional positive regard. Like those raised with unconditional positive regard know that they're loved and accepted no matter who they are and what they achieve or what they become. And those who are raised with more conditional self-regard think that their love and acceptance is based on meeting certain conditions and being a certain way and achieving certain things. And so I do wonder also if this ties to that in a sense, though that's not really related. It's just a question that it makes me ask as we think about this.
No, I think that is probably definitely true, right? If we didn't get that, I think it could certainly be tied to it. And part of it is that it's different for each of us. Like I think thinking about, even when you heard that the topic today was self-compassion or saw it pop up, in your podcast feed, like if that brings up a certain associations or certain feelings, or you had certain thoughts about what it meant or what it didn't mean, I think it sometimes can be helpful to do a little bit of this unpacking and going, okay, where did that start? Like, where did I start to get this idea that if I was too gentle and kind and compassionate with myself, that some bad thing would happen, or that I wouldn't be the type of person who I want to be? If any of that came up, I think it's just always good to explore where that stuff comes from.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. There could be so many different reasons why we feel the way we feel. And they may have to do with how we were raised. They may just have to do with how we're feeling in this moment, especially for grieving. A lot of times we feel like, I remember the person I was before, and now I'm this person, and this person feels like really uncomfortable, and it's really making me question my sense of identity and my self-esteem and my self-concept. And that is really making me feel like I need to be very hard on myself to get back to who I was before. I might have internalized all these assumptions about what grief looks like, how long grief takes, quote unquote, what stages grief is supposed to go through. And now this is much more difficult than I thought it was going to be. So I'm wondering, like, what's wrong with me? And, in the end, I hope everybody listening knows, like, it is supposed to be really hard, all the losses, the secondary losses you're going through. Grief impacts every domain of our living, physical, cognitive, emotional, interpersonal. It impacts us in so many different ways. The fact that grief stays with us, it's not time limited. There's so many different factors that make grief so hard. But I do think we can be really hard on ourselves about how we're doing our grief. And unfortunately, that's just a thing that we do. And so that's why we think self-compassion is so important.
Yeah, and I think, to define, I don't know if I don't have in front of me like a clear, concise definition for self-compassion. If we were more organized podcasters, we probably would have had a definition right in front of us. But I think, Kristen Neff is
Mm-hmm.
sort of the go-to person, researcher, person who put, I think, self-compassion, at least in recent years, on the map. And the initial way that she conceptualizes what self-compassion is, I think, is helpful for us to just frame in this conversation about how she breaks it down to help us understand a little bit more of what it is, because I think it can feel abstract to just say,
Yeah.
oh, show yourself self-compassion. And so she breaks it down into these initially three sections, and then she sort of has built on those and added three more. But she started with this idea of self-compassion is treating ourselves with self-kindness instead of self-judgment. And then an idea of connecting with our common humanity instead of our isolation, instead of kind of just
Mm-hmm.
going back to ourselves. And then connecting with mindfulness of sort of who we are and what we're feeling and what we're doing instead of over identification. So, that idea of sort of I can have a feeling without being defined by a feeling.
Right.
And so I think that when we like dig into each of those, it starts to give a little bit of a path towards
Mm-hmm.
one piece for her of what self-compassion looks like,
Yeah.
which I think can be helpful. I don't know. I don't know
Yeah, no,
what your thoughts are.
I've always thought that her approach, it makes a concept, like you said, that feels very abstract and sometimes buzzwordy, feel actually very reasonable and realistic, and sensible to me. I think
Yeah.
the idea of just looking at these different pieces, maybe for a second, I love the idea of self-kindness. I think it is in contrast to self-judgment. I think it's also in contrast to that idea that we were talking about with self-esteem, where somebody might need to feel better or special in order to receive kindness. She basically says, like, we should be kind to ourselves because we're humans who are deserving of kindness, whether or not we feel like, we're on top of the world, on our A game, or whether we feel like we're at our worst point. We are humans who are deserving of compassion and kindness. And that is why we should give it to ourselves, not because we merit it in some special way. And even that just feels like a shift for me. Because, like you said, I do think we have that inner critical voice that especially comes out when we're feeling low. And that voice is like that drill sergeant, yelling in our ear, telling us, like, what are you doing? You got to get out of bed. You're going to, like, waste another work day, all these things. And we might feel like that's helping us, but, I don't find it actually that motivating.
No, and I love when sometimes people talk about this idea and bring it down to like, think about if it was a child who was trying to learn math, right? And if you imagine being in a room with that child and how you would talk to them and what might help them to learn math and, improve and actually move towards the thing that is important to them, would it be screaming at them, you're not good at math, you're not trying hard enough, you're being lazy, why aren't you doing this, what? Or would it be saying, like, you're doing a good job, you're working through this, this is really tough, you're
Yeah.
going through something difficult. Of course, when we look at that, we're able to see, like, yeah, the thing that is going to allow that child to be able to move towards the thing that is important to them is going to be the kind way of coaching them through it, not the screaming at them about how they're not doing well enough. But when it comes to ourselves,
Yeah.
we can't always do it that way.
Well, another reason why that's such a great example is because if you've ever tried to teach a kid math who isn't getting it is one of the most frustrating experiences. And your first instinct sometimes is to kind of like lose your cool or get frustrated or even yell. And I think you do have to kind of like get past that in order to find a way that feels more encouraging and more supportive. So that's one of the reasons why I really like this idea of shifting to that self-kindness. We're always going to have that inner critical voice. Like we're not going to eliminate him, but we can kind of just like face it and say like, no, we're going to take maybe a different approach
Yep.
to this for a little while. Let's test this out and see if this works better. Because,
Yeah.
it becomes very natural to have those automatic thoughts.
Automatic thoughts. And, one thing, this doesn't come from Kristen Neff's work, though I'm sure she would get on board with it,
Right.
but that comes from a lot of other therapeutic approaches, is that sometimes it can be helpful if you realize you do have that, like the mean inner critic, the one who is always talking to you in that really negative voice and is, trying to use that approach of beating yourself up, that distancing yourself from it
Mm-hmm.
by thinking of it as kind of something, a piece of you that's separate from you, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
being able to name that voice. If you have a grief inner critic, if you've realized that that's there, being able to give it a name, give it a personality, see it as something outside of yourself so that when it starts to come up, you're like, oh yeah, there it is. Like I hear Isabel, my mean, like grief inner
Yeah.
voice. It allows us a separation from it that can remind us, like, this isn't the only way to talk to myself.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Mm-hmm.
yes, that might be the voice that comes up first, comes up strongest, just like the part of you with when you're teaching the kid math that's like comes up, but that you can sometimes go, oh, okay, wait a minute. There she is talking to me that way. And there's another part of me that wants to respond to me differently, right? Like there's another part of me that doesn't agree with her, that doesn't speak that language, and that is going to try to respond differently. And that it can sort of help us to pull back from it. And this is really connected a little bit to what Kristen Neff talks about in that third piece of her of this process, which is mindfulness. Part of what she talks about with that mindfulness is how do we become aware of the way that we're either talking kindly or not kindly to ourselves. Are we over identifying with that critic inside of us, or are we over identifying with some of those things? Or can we kind of change and be more mindfully present and
Mm-hmm.
aware of how this voice is coming up in us, and then decide to shift and see things a little bit differently?
Yeah. The second piece, we're kind of jumping around a little bit,
Yeah.
but the second piece, that idea of the kind of shared common humanity, I also especially like for grief, because what it basically says is like, we're all people who experience suffering and who experience the roller coaster of life, the ups and downs of life. And so we all share this in common. So we don't need to be at the top of the roller coaster to be treated like a human or to be treated well, because this is just what it means to be a human living in this earth. This is just what it means to be going through our lives and kind of learning and growing and changing and having experiences. And when we can kind of look at this, we can see that, other people, even though they might not have the exact same experiences as us, even though they might not understand us on every level, there's a lot of things that we share here in our suffering, even in our suffering, in our healing, and in everything in between. And so I think with grief, especially, this feels very relevant because loss is the one thing everybody is going to experience. No one else is going to experience it exactly like you, but everybody will experience it on some level. And so I do think sometimes we might look around and say, oh, we're different than that person. We're less deserving than that person of compassion and grief. We're more deserving than that person. We do that comparison game. But I think what can be really helpful is just looking at how this is a part of our human experience. And that doesn't make it okay. That doesn't make your experience any less tragic. But I do think that it, on some level, can bring sort of a little bit of perspective and sometimes comfort as we're kind of making sense of what it means to be living in the wake of loss and grieving.
Yeah, and I think that connects with what you mentioned earlier. Again, not to deconstruct everything to childhood, but that idea about where do our feelings come from about a sort of positive self-regard, or a belief that we all have times where we feel like we're inadequate or struggling too much or not doing as well as we should be doing. You know, we like all of these things, they're part of our common humanity is having that experience and having a belief that, again, we can share that with others. We can be vulnerable. We can be open about some of those things without the fear of maybe rejection, or that I think one of the things that is deep in us from a biological evolutionary perspective is, you know, we always fear being rejected by the tribe, right? We
Yeah.
fear that people are going to judge us. We fear that vulnerability is going to be perceived as a sign of weakness. One of the other things on that fear of self-compassion scale that is on there is the fear of being perceived as weak by other people if we're too kind and compassionate to ourselves. And it can be really helpful and important in grief to be open about our struggles and to be open about how hard it is. And I think sometimes being able to connect with our common humanity, of really being able to remember and believe that there are so many other people who are suffering and struggling in similar ways or very different ways. And that even though it can feel really scary and unsafe to be open about those things, that actually when we are open about it and we can find safe places to connect and be vulnerable and appreciate that shared humanity, that it can actually be really an important part of our grief, and that can help us to be kinder to ourselves when we are realize that we can be so kind to other people, right? Like you end up in that support group or talking to a grief friend or someone else who's grieving, and you see yourself extending all of this compassion towards them. And sometimes that can be the mirror that reflects back, like, wow, this is the same stuff that I've been beating myself up for months. And now here I am sitting next to a person who I care about, extending that compassion that I wasn't able to
Yeah.
extend to myself. So it's just so important in so many ways.
It's always so interesting to me, this idea that showing emotion, acknowledging emotion and struggling means weakness, when in reality, I feel like it is quite the opposite. Like being able to show what you're experiencing and feeling, I think requires immense bravery a lot of the time, and which I perceive as being one opposite to weakness. And, you know, when we go through loss, we are more vulnerable for a time, but the struggle ultimately, I think, teaches us a lot about ourselves and other people in the world and can make us a lot stronger. So that's not really related to self-compassion, except to say that it's not weak to be open and honest and acknowledge what you're going through. But of course, I understand the fear. So one of the things that you mentioned is Chris and Neff kind of built on the conceptualization that's like this three-pronged thing. A little bit in response to, I think, how some people perceive self-kindness and apply self-kindness to their lives. I think one of the fears with self-kindness that we often have to kind of navigate is that it will cause you to let yourself off the hook and make you make excuses for not moving forward. But as she talks about in this like elaboration that she laid out, it's actually contrary to that.
Yeah, she talks about in more recent research and book that she wrote, what she labels as fierce self-compassion, as compared to what she had talked about in her earlier work as what she labeled tender self-compassion. And in fierce self-compassion, what she talks about coming to appreciate more later in her work, later in her career, because of some personal experiences that she had, was a recognition that sometimes you need to use an energy with your self-compassion that actually is a little bit more focused on protective action. Like she talks about in the 3 additional kind of add-on items to the self-kindness, the common humanity, and mindfulness, this idea of protecting, providing, and motivating. And that self-compassion, that those 3 things are critical pieces of self-compassion as well. And so she talks about with protecting, the idea that sometimes we realize that we need to find ways to tap into being brave or committed or setting boundaries to keep ourselves safe, that we might have to say no to certain things and take action in ways that will maybe alleviate some of our suffering in a way that she didn't necessarily think was captured fully in some of her earlier discussions of self-compassion.
Mhm.
And then she goes on to talk about, so with that, she says you might have to set boundaries, you might have to stand
Mhm.
up for yourself, you might have to give people feedback. And so self-compassion is about taking action sometimes to care for
Right.
ourselves by protecting ourselves.
But this is less of like confirming that if you engage in self compassion, you're letting yourself off the hook, and more kind of saying that the most self compassionate thing is to help yourself live a life that's in accordance with things that you value and things that you find meaning in and things that you find purpose in, and a life that isn't kind of focused around like avoidance and things like that. So self compassion in this context might mean in grief doing hard things so that you can maybe engage in the memory of your loved one, or so that you can engage with people or go certain places. So it might mean doing hard things to live a life that feels more full.
Yes. And that there is something that, again, we may be able to see the ways that we would extend that to other people, but we have struggled to do that ourselves. So I think that can be a piece of this, is that she's trying to differentiate that we can, sometimes we're willing to take action on behalf of other people. We're able to be protective and proactive of
Mm,
other people. And yet sometimes we are not that protective of ourselves. And like she talks about, to provide as well and being more providers. And I think for people who have maybe been caretakers, of thinking about how much you have provided for other people or given to other people, but sometimes at that self-sacrificing of one's own needs. And so she says sometimes we need to commit to the idea that we will provide to ourselves just like we would to someone else. We'll
mm,
honor our own needs and have a balance between kind of giving and receiving, and be able to recognize that sometimes that again means that we're going to have
mhm.
to set
Yeah.
boundaries or say yes to our own needs in ways that in the past we might not have.
Yeah, and of course this shifts and changes, and especially in grief. Like I could see in the early days thinking about what you really need. It might be just kind of that rest and that withdrawing inward a little bit and taking time for themselves. But over time, that might look a little bit different in terms of what you want and need. And so I do think that this is something that's probably constantly evolving and ebbing and flowing. And
Mhm.
so it is something that I think it's not like we necessarily have this cognitive shift and all of a sudden we're like, oh, okay, I get that. I'm going to start doing that. I think it's something that we probably have to remind ourselves to practice on a regular basis.
Yes, I think that very much it is something that we have to remind ourselves to do, and it doesn't always come easily, like, it's a practice. And I think that, Kristen Neff, I think, would say that about all of these things, that self-compassion in general is a practice. Like, it's something that it's not a one-time thing, it's something that we have to kind of engage and re-engage with each component of this on a pretty
Mhm.
regular basis. The last one, I think, also for me feels like it's one that often resonates a lot with people who are grieving, or at least it comes up as one of those concerns about self compassion. And I think maybe this is her response to it in some way, is that she talks about the idea of motivating ourselves. And I think one fear that sometimes we hear that you've kind of referenced is that fear of, oh, if I'm so compassionate with myself about where I am in my grief, it's just me saying, okay, well, self compassion is just embracing my grief, no matter what it looks like, no matter how it feels. I just have to be in a place of being kind and compassionate with myself. And so, therefore, I don't encourage any sort of movement. And there can be a
Mhm.
fear of like, wow, if I'm in that deep grief where I'm just like cocooned up at home and socially isolated, and I feel how easy it would be to just stay at the bottom of this hole. Is self-compassion going to contribute to me staying in the bottom of the hole instead of trying to find a way to pull myself back up? And I think Kristen Neff would say it's not, right? It goes back to that math problem. It's not, being kind to yourself isn't going to keep you at the bottom of the hole more than screaming at yourself to get out of the hole is
Mm.
going to help you. But I think she does say it is important for us sometimes to take the space to create a vision for what we want things to look like. She says that part of extending kind of care to ourselves is to care about ourselves enough to recognize that we can want change while also accepting ourselves for where we are. And that the idea of motivating and self-compassion, she says, is to give ourselves permission to create a vision of how we might want things to change, what we might want to see change in some way, to be both grateful for, our common humanity and the things that connect us in the world where maybe we really are struggling, and also saying that we can want to help ourselves to set goals or intentions and support ourselves in moving in a new direction, and that can be
Yeah.
part of self-compassion too. And she says sometimes, depending on the situation, that we use sometimes difficult emotions, we use things like anger or guilt or some of those other things that are hard to serve as motivators to propel us forward a little bit in some of the momentum or motion that we might need to move in a new direction. So I think it's that
Yeah.
there's a little bit of dialectical thinking in there of like holding two truths at the same time, of being able to say like, I am both doing the best that I can and also trying to do something
Mhm.
else or something differently. And I deserve kindness and compassion, no matter how I'm doing right now. And I want to show myself care through creating a vision of where I'm trying to go.
Yeah. I like that she aligned herself with that idea of motivation and potentially like the desire to change, because I could see people thinking of this as an either or thing where it's either self-compassion or motivation, like you said, with that dialectical thinking and needing to kind of say it can be both. We might say to ourselves, like, okay, we're going to shut the inner drill sergeant up for a little while and give ourselves self-compassion. But then when it's time to make movement or motivate ourselves, we get that guy back out again. And it doesn't need to be that way. Like, we can encourage ourselves and move forward and change in a way that is also self-compassionate. So I like that she did take it the next step, because I do think that that is important. And again, I think that it's just important to kind of really be very curious about your feelings and your thoughts and where you were in the beginning, what maybe you felt you needed in the beginning might have been one thing, but I do think it's important to ask yourself, like, how am I feeling now? Am I starting to
Mhm.
feel restless, or am I starting to feel ready for something different, or maybe I'm starting to feel strong enough to take a step, and maybe I need to reevaluate like what it means to give myself that self-compassion. So I appreciate that she kind of added that layer, because I think it is really important.
Yeah, I think it is as well. And I think the other piece that's sort of connected but a little different that I like that she pulls out is the reminder that we don't have to feel positive towards ourselves to be compassionate to ourselves.
Mhm.
And I think, she talks about using that example of not just thinking about people who we love, who we've been caretakers for, or who we care about, or what we would do to a friend for a friend or say to a friend, but actually thinking about how we've extended kindness and compassion to people who we really don't like. That
Mhm.
sometimes we oftentimes have many situations in life where we can think about how we have extended care or compassion or kindness to someone who we didn't like at all. And she shares this reminder to say, to the point you made earlier, Elle, about self-esteem, we are capable of, as humans, of extending compassion even when we really don't like someone. Like
Right.
we can do that. And that means we can do it to ourselves. That means even if
Mhm.
we are in the toilet with our self-esteem, even if we feel like we are absolutely useless and we feel really bad about ourselves, that doesn't mean we can't still treat ourselves with
Mhm.
kindness and compassion and care. And, I think it's such an important reminder because sometimes in grief, like we don't have a positive outlook towards ourselves, and that's just real.
Yeah. I mean, even if it's not at that extreme level where it's like someone you don't like think about all the people in your life that you accept even though there are many things about them that that you don't like, or even though they may have flaws, you still choose to be friends with them or to love them or to embrace them. And so think about all the times you do that for everybody else and still kind of have that love towards them. And how we might not do that for ourselves. So I think it's really a spectrum, right?
Mhm.
So yeah, I think that those are kind of some of the main things that really stand out about self-compassion and why it's such a relevant idea for people who are grieving. And we hope that other people can, take a few nuggets from this, even if it still feels like a struggle, can take a few pieces of this and try and think about whether they make sense for how you approach yourself.
And yeah, and if you want to dive a little bit more deeply into this, I mean, obviously there's Kristen Neff's work, which we've been plugging a lot, but also on May 20th, we're going to have our next free webinar in our webinar
Hmm.
series. And the topic of that is going to be self-compassion and grief. And it is going to be a little bit more hands-on and really thinking about how to give you some tools if you're working on building a self-compassion practice that is based on some of these principles that we're talking about, but with some just tangible ideas and some writing prompts and some different things that might help you to explore self-compassion yourself, think about some of the historical stuff, where it is now for you, and how you can just build a realistic self-compassion practice in your grief. So I will put the
Yeah.
link in the show notes if you want to register for that. For those of you who are in the hub, I think it's if it's not already posted, we'll put it in the hub too. And
Hmm.
yeah, would love to have some of you join us for that.
Yeah, and even if you're listening to this afterwards and you missed that webinar,
Yeah.
speaking of the hub, our Center for Learning and Community and everything, we have done a lot in the community about this through some of the different kind of webinars and presentations and stuff. So we have resources there as well for anybody who decides to join that community.
Link down below for joining that hub as well.
All right, thanks everybody.